Hi, guys. Welcome back to the Journey Podcast. We are going to dive into a book that I recently just read called The Defining Decade. Now, this is a book that was recommended to me to actually, I was at a mastermind in Miami. It was Ravi Abuvala's mastermind. I actually was speaking to Ravi's significant other, and we were talking about relationships. We were talking about dating, and she recommended this book called The Defining Decade. And essentially, what this book is about is why our 20s are actually more important than we give them credit for. And there's a belief going on with like the millennial generation and even some of the Gen Z generation that 30s are the new 20s and that people are getting their life started later in life, meaning that people are waiting to get secure jobs into the 30s. People aren't buying houses into the 30s. People aren't settling down to relationships into the 30s. And I think the reason why that's such a cultural norm now is because we have a lot of freedom now that can be enjoyed at an earlier age in life, and we don't actually need to have kids until later. Like life expectancy is longer, and we have a lot of systems in place for we as a human race to be able to support our lives for a longer time, and so there's no rush to really get things started. But what they found in this book, or what this book was essentially all about, was like a lot of mental illnesses or mental health issues comes from not getting your life started early, right? A lot of people in their mid 20s are depressed, they have anxiety because they're not actually joining the real world earlier enough, and they feel unaligned with their reality. And the 20s is a tough time because everybody's growing at a different rate. Some people are getting married and buying houses early in their 20s. Some people are still living at the parents' house and single and dating around in their late 20s. And so there's no real, rule book as to like where your life should be by a certain time in your 20s. But essentially the big takeaways that I got from this book was like your 20s should not be a time to be, wasted. They should be very intentional because by the time you get to your 30s, life is going to change and you're going to have to play catch up. Right. What they found is that in a lot of these books, a lot of the 20-year-olds that were, messing around in their 20s and kind of being unintentional were severely far behind on their lives by the time they got to their 30s. And that these are the people that ended up alone. These are the people that ended up depressed, people that ended up broke. And so I learned from this book that your 20s are a time that you should not take for granted. You should use this time to date. The big thing that was surprising to me is how intentional dating was about this book. Is like you should take intentional time to date with your significant other. You should talk about marriage. You should talk about the future. You should talk about what you want from a relationship long term. Because by the time you're 30, you're gonna have that shit figured out. Especially for females too, because even though our 30s are the new 20s, it's not that way for our bodies. Right? There's hormonal changes that females go through in their 30s that make it more difficult to be fertile. And so you have to start planting those seeds early on in your 20s. And this is something that I talk about with Megan all the time is I'm pretty much committed fully to Megan in our relationship. And the reason I would never leave is obviously because I want a future with her. And, I love a relationship and she's like, honestly, just the best person I can ever have. But if something were to change, it would be too late to restart. Like that shit completely derails your life. And I don't think people are putting enough they're not putting enough emphasis on how big of a derailment faulty relationships can be, especially if you're 25, 26, 27. Let's say that you've been dating your significant other for the last 2 years. Well, you need to have some serious conversations about where you want this relationship to go, because if this isn't the right person, you're wasting time with the wrong person. Well, by the time you're 28, 29, 30, and you start thinking about marriage, you realize that you're in a relationship with the wrong person. You're going to have to end that relationship, spend a year or two to get over that relationship, spend another year or two to meet someone new and get to know them. And who's to say that that person's the right one? So you want to make sure that you're using your 20s to intentionally find a partner that you can stick with long term. That way, by the time you're 30, you are in a good place moving forward. The same thing they talked about with your career too. Like you don't want to just, I think what they called it was unemployed and underemployed. There's a huge underemployment with 20-year-olds who are qualified to do high level jobs, but they're choosing to work at restaurants or they're choosing to work as baristas because they don't want to grow up and get a real job just yet. But what happens is that they miss out on time in which they're able to build up a resume and build up experience. Even though they have to work at the bottom, they're losing out on what's called identity credit, which is the first time I've ever heard of it. I think it's great, and I'll explain that concept in a second. But they're losing out on opportunity to build up their resume, build up their experience. That way, by the time they're 30, they can qualify for their dream job or get the experience for the dream job. Whereas if they're underemployed and screwing around as a barista or a babysitter or these easy jobs that just pay the bills, well, then when it's time that they're 30, they're going to be severely underexperienced and they're going to have a really hard time getting a big girl or big boy job. One of the things that they talked about was identity credit. Essentially, this comes from not like making money in your 20s, but doing things and getting experience that adds to your identity. For myself, for example, an identity credit would be like doing the retreat. So doing the PTBI and FTF retreat, that has now added to my identity because it's formed to who I am because I've had that experience. I am now like leveled up myself and my own identity because that credit counts towards identity credit. An example of this would be like, imagine if someone was working as a barista and they went to go start doing like assistant work for a producer, right? Well, that assistant work for a producer probably isn't paying anything more than the barista, and the barista is probably easier work, but the assistant work for the producer adds identity credit. So by the time that person's 30, they already have experience in the space that they want to be in, which is going to get them set up later. So the premise of this book called The Defining Decade, and if you're in your 20s, I highly recommend reading it, is just to not let your 20s go for granted. Take advantage of your 20s, use this time to get experience, use this time to go after your dreams, use this time to intentionally set relationships, and make shit happen with your life. Be very intentional with your life and where you want to go and what you want to do. They found that the people who are very intentional about growing up and getting on with their lives are the ones that are far more happier in their 30s and 40s than the ones who, wasted time, partied, and was underemployed until the 30s. And then when the 30s hit, they thought, holy shit, I got to get my shit together. But by the time that happens, it's already too late. So hopefully this inspired you guys to kick yourselves in the ass. If you guys want to check out the book, it's called The Defining Decade on Amazon. And with that being said, we'll catch you in the next episode.